There's a photograph no one talks about, taken sometime in the early 1800s, grainy and faded. It shows a family gathered on the porch of a plantation house in rural Virginia. At first glance, it's just another relic of American history, but look closer. Look at the eyes. Look at the jaw structures. Look at the way certain features repeat themselves with unnatural precision across generations. This isn't just a family portrait. This is evidence of something far darker, something that didn't end with that photograph. Something that carried forward, generation after generation, written into the very DNA of an American bloodline that refused to let outsiders in. This is the story of the Whitaker family of West Virginia, and what happened to them didn't happen by accident. It happened by design, and the isolation began long before the cameras ever found them, long before the internet turned their existence into a viral curiosity. The roots of this legacy stretch back to the earliest days of American settlement, when families carved out territories in the Appalachian Mountains and decided that the outside world was a threat to be kept at arm's length. These weren't simple farmers making do with what they had. These were people who made a choice to keep bloodlines pure, to keep property within the family, to ensure that wealth, land, and legacy never left the family name. And in making that choice, they set in motion a genetic catastrophe that would echo through centuries. And the Whitaker family settled in Odd, West Virginia, a town whose name now feels like a prophecy. By the mid-1800s, they had established themselves as landowners, isolated by choice and by geography. The mountains became their walls, the valleys became their kingdoms, and within those boundaries, marriages happened that should never have happened. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The family tree didn't branch outward, it twisted inward, collapsing on itself like a structure built without support. And with each generation, the genetic load grew heavier, and by the early 1900s, the consequences were already visible. Children born with cognitive disabilities, speech impediments that made communication nearly impossible, physical deformities that marked them as different from the moment they drew breath. But the family didn't stop. They didn't seek outside help. They didn't break the pattern, because to them, this wasn't a problem. This was tradition. This was loyalty. This was what it meant to be a Whitaker. The outside world was the enemy. The outside world would take what was theirs, and so they continued, generation after generation, locked in a cycle that biology itself was screaming for them to end. And the modern world discovered the Whitakers in 2020, when a photographer and videographer named Mark Leda ventured into Odd, West Virginia, with a camera and a curiosity about the rumors he'd heard. What he found was a family living in conditions that seemed frozen in time. A family whose members communicated in grunts and gestures, whose physical appearances told a story that no one wanted to acknowledge. The video went viral. Millions watched. Millions were horrified. But what most people didn't understand was that this wasn't some bizarre anomaly. This was the logical conclusion of a decision made 200 years ago. A decision to never let the bloodline be diluted. A decision that turned human beings into a genetic experiment conducted across centuries. And here's what haunts me most. The Whitakers aren't unique. They're just the ones we found. Across Appalachia, across rural America, across the hidden pockets of this country where isolation became identity, there are families who made the same choice. Families whose trees collapsed inward. Families whose children paid the price for their ancestors' pride. The Whitakers are simply the ones who were documented, the ones who were exposed. But the legacy of inbreeding in America runs deeper than one family in one forgotten town. It runs through the soil itself. And the science of what happens when bloodlines fold in on themselves isn't complicated. It's brutally simple. Every human being carries recessive genes. Traits that remain dormant, hidden beneath dominant ones. In a healthy population with genetic diversity, these recessive genes rarely find their match. They stay buried. But when close relatives reproduce, when the gene pool shrinks to the size of a single family, those recessive traits don't just surface. They collide, they compound, they multiply. And the results are written on the faces and in the minds of children who never asked to be born into this experiment. And the Whitaker children of the 20th century bore the marks of this genetic compression. Microcephaly, a condition where the skull doesn't develop properly, leaving the brain with insufficient space to grow. Prognathism, where the jaw protrudes forward in a way that makes eating and speaking difficult. Intellectual disabilities so severe that some family members never learned to form sentences. These weren't random misfortunes. These were mathematical certainties. When siblings reproduce, their offspring have a 25% chance of inheriting 2 copies of a harmful recessive gene. When cousins reproduce, that risk drops slightly, but remains significant. When this happens generation after generation, the odds don't just add up. They guarantee devastation. But here's what the science can't fully capture. the lived experience of being born into a body and mind shaped by your ancestors' choices. Imagine being Ray Whitaker, filmed by Mark Leda, trying to communicate through sounds that approximate language but never quite reach it. Imagine being Loreen, whose physical appearance became the subject of internet horror and fascination, dissected by strangers who would never meet her, never know her, never see her as anything more than a cautionary tale. Imagine knowing on some level that you are the way you are because your great-great-grandparents decided that strangers were more dangerous than genetic catastrophe, and the Whitaker family lived in structures that were falling apart, roofs that leaked, walls that had rotted through, no running water in some of the homes. Basic hygiene became impossible. Medical care was non-existent. But the physical poverty was almost secondary to the biological poverty that had been inflicted upon them. They were surrounded by wealth in the form of land, acres and acres that had been in the family for generations. But that land meant nothing when the people who inherited it lacked the cognitive capacity to manage it, to farm it, to do anything with it except exist on it in a state of survival that looked more like waiting than living. And the community around them knew. Of course they knew. In small towns, everyone knows everything. But there's a code of silence that descends over places like West Virginia. A refusal to interfere. A cultural norm that says what happens in a family stays in a family. The neighbors watched the Whitaker children grow up different. They heard the rumors, they saw the results. But no one called authorities. No one intervened. Because in Appalachia, in rural America, privacy isn't just respected. It's weaponized. It becomes the shield behind which horrors are allowed to continue generation after generation, hidden in plain sight. And when Mark Leda's video surfaced, the internet reacted with a mixture of horror and fascination. Millions of views, thousands of comments, armchair geneticists explaining the science, moral philosophers debating whether it was ethical to film them at all. But very few people asked the question that matters most. Why did this happen? Not the biological mechanics, not the how, but the why. Why did a family in America, in the land of opportunity and expansion and endless possibility, choose to turn inward so completely that they destroyed themselves from within? The answer lies not in ignorance, but in ideology, not in accident, but in intention. And the Whitakers were taught, generation after generation, that outsiders were a threat, that marriage outside the family meant losing land, losing identity, losing control. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was a deliberate strategy for maintaining power and wealth within a single bloodline. It's the same logic that drove European royalty to marry cousins and siblings for centuries. The Habsburgs of Austria infamously bred themselves into genetic oblivion, their distinctive Habsburg jaw becoming a symbol of dynastic inbreeding. The Whitakers were doing the same thing, but without the palaces and the portraits. They were committing the same genetic suicide, but in poverty instead of luxury. And it worked, in a sense. The land stayed in the family. The name remained unbroken. But the people became something else entirely. They became evidence of what happens when ideology overrides biology, when family pride becomes family prison, when the fear of outsiders becomes more powerful than the love of your own children's future. And there's a moment in Mark Leda's footage that most people overlook. He's sitting with the Whitakers on their porch, and one of them, Larry, is speaking. The words are slurred, difficult to parse, but he's trying to communicate something. He's trying to tell a story. And if you listen carefully, beneath the impediment, beneath the struggle, there's a human being trying to be understood, trying to be seen as more than a curiosity. And that's when it hits you. These aren't specimens. These aren't case studies. These are people who were born into a trap that was set before they existed, and they've spent their entire lives living inside the consequences of decisions they never made. And the origins of American inbreeding run deeper than most want to acknowledge. It wasn't just the Whitakers. It wasn't just Appalachia. When European settlers pushed westward, they carried with them ideas about bloodline purity that had festered in the old world for centuries. The landed gentry of England married within narrow circles to keep estates intact. The aristocracy of France did the same, and when these people or their ideological descendants carved out homesteads in the American wilderness, they brought that same mentality with them. But here, without the social structures and visibility of European society, without courts and churches keeping records, the practice went underground. It became invisible. It became normalized in pockets of isolation where no one was watching. And in the mountains of West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, families established themselves on land that was difficult to access and harder to leave. The geography itself became an accomplice. These weren't communities in the traditional sense. These were compounds. Extended families living within a few miles of each other, sometimes within a few hundred yards, marrying within a gene pool that might consist of 20, 30, maybe 50 people total. And when you're choosing a spouse from a pool that's small, the math becomes inevitable. Your options are your cousins, your second cousins. And if you've been raised to believe that outsiders are dangerous, that strangers can't be trusted, that keeping blood pure is keeping family strong, then those cousins start to look like the only logical choice. And by the 1930s and 40s, social workers and researchers began documenting what they found in Appalachia. Reports of families where multiple generations showed signs of intellectual disability, where children were born deaf, blind, or with severe physical deformities at rates far higher than the general population. But these reports were often buried, filed away, forgotten, because acknowledging the problem meant acknowledging the cause, and the cause was uncomfortable. It meant admitting that American families, white American families in particular, had been practicing something that looked uncomfortably similar to what they accused others of doing. It meant confronting the reality that the mythology of the American frontier, of independent families carving out their own destinies, had a dark underside that no one wanted to examine, and the Whitakers weren't just practicing inbreeding, they were perfecting it. By the time Mark Leda found them, they represented multiple generations of concentrated genetic damage. Betty, one of the family members, appeared to function at a higher level than her siblings. She could speak, though with difficulty. She could communicate. But even she showed signs of the family's genetic burden. Her children, the next generation, were even more severely affected. One of them, Timmy, was nonverbal, communicating only through grunts and physical gestures. Another, Lorene, had physical features so distinctive that medical professionals who viewed the footage could diagnose probable genetic conditions from appearance alone. But here's what haunts me about Timmy and Lorene and the others like them. They know they're different. You can see it in their eyes. There's an awareness there. A consciousness trapped inside bodies and minds that don't function the way they should. They watch Mark Leda's camera with curiosity, with caution, with something that looks like hope. Hope that maybe someone seeing this will understand, will help, will do something other than gawk. And what happened instead? The internet turned them into a spectacle. Reaction videos, commentary channels, true crime documentaries that framed them as monsters or victims, but rarely as human beings who deserved better than the genetic hand they were dealt. And the cruelty of it is staggering when you sit with it long enough. These people didn't choose their parents, didn't choose to be born into a family that had been marrying itself for generations, didn't choose the poverty, the isolation, the complete absence of medical care or educational opportunity. They were born into a machine that had been running for 200 years, a machine designed to keep bloodlines pure and property consolidated, and by the time they arrived, the machine was producing only wreckage, human wreckage, and the same ideology that built the machine prevented anyone from turning it off. And there's a question I keep coming back to. At what point did someone in the Whitaker family line know this was wrong? At what point did a father look at his child, born with severe disabilities, and think, this has to stop? Or a mother, watching her daughter struggle to speak, to walk, to exist, and realize that the family's choices had created this? Surely someone knew. Surely someone saw the pattern. But if they did, they didn't act on it. Or they couldn't. Because by then, the damage was generational. The gene pool was so compromised that even if they had brought in outside genetics, the recessive genes were already there, already loaded, already waiting to express themselves in future children. The trap had closed completely, and there's a term geneticists use when they're being polite. Coefficient of inbreeding. It's a number, a percentage, that represents how much of your DNA is identical by descent, meaning how much of your genetic code comes from ancestors who were themselves related. For most people, that number is close to 0. For the children of first cousins, it jumps to 6.25%. For the children of siblings, it skyrockets to 25%. And for families like the Whitakers, where this happened generation after generation, where the family tree looks less like a tree and more like a telephone pole, that number becomes almost impossible to calculate. Because you're not just dealing with one instance of inbreeding. You're dealing with a genetic echo chamber where the same damaged genes bounce back and forth across generations, amplifying themselves, compounding their effects, until the human body itself becomes a record of ancestral choices. And the Whitaker family's isolation wasn't just geographical. It was psychological, cultural. They were raised to believe that they were different from other people, special, that their way of life was worth protecting at any cost, and that belief system created a prison more effective than any physical barrier. Because even when the roads improved, even when cars became common, even when the outside world became accessible in ways it never had been before, the Whitakers stayed. They stayed in odd West Virginia. They stayed in their compound. They stayed within their bloodline. Not because they had to, but because leaving meant betraying everything they'd been taught to value. It meant admitting that their ancestors had been wrong, and that admission was too costly to make. And Mark Leta's interactions with the family revealed something unexpected. They weren't hostile. They weren't violent or dangerous. They were, in many ways, gentle, childlike. They showed him their dogs, their property, the things that mattered to them. They smiled for his camera. They seemed, despite everything, to possess a kind of innocence. But that innocence is what makes this so unbearable, because innocence implies a lack of knowledge, a lack of culpability, and these people are innocent. They are victims of a system they inherited, not architects of it. The guilt belongs to the generations before them, the ones who knew better or should have, the ones who chose family purity over human welfare, the ones who looked at the mounting evidence of genetic damage and decided it was an acceptable price to pay. And in the 1970s and 80s, as modern genetics began to mature as a science, researchers started to understand just how catastrophic inbreeding could be. Studies of isolated populations around the world, from remote Pacific islands to closed religious communities, showed consistent patterns: increased infant mortality, higher rates of genetic disorders, shortened lifespans, reduced fertility. The human body, it turns out, requires genetic diversity to function properly. We need fresh DNA, new combinations, the mixing of distant bloodlines to repair the constant mutations that occur naturally in every generation. Without that diversity, we collapse, we fail, we become like the Whitakers. But the Whitakers weren't alone, even in America. In the 1980s, the FLDS, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was discovered to have been practicing systematic inbreeding for decades. Led by prophets who arranged marriages within a closed community of a few thousand people, the FLDS created a genetic catastrophe. Children were born with fumarase deficiency, a rare genetic disorder so severe that most victims never learned to walk or talk. The condition was so rare that there were only 13 documented cases in the entire world before the FLDS. Within their community, there were at least 20, possibly many more. And the church leaders knew. They understood what they were doing. But they continued anyway, because maintaining doctrinal purity, maintaining control, was more important than the suffering of children. And the Whitakers never had a prophet. They never had a doctrine. They just had tradition. And somehow, that makes it worse. Because at least the FLDs could point to religious belief, to divine command, however twisted. The Whitakers just had the accumulated weight of generational habit. The unspoken agreement that this is how we've always done it. The assumption that what worked for great-grandfather would work for us. Except it didn't work for great-grandfather either. It was already failing then. But no one was counting. No one was keeping track of the children who died young, the ones who were hidden away, the ones who were too damaged to be acknowledged even within the family. And there's a photograph that Mark Leta took, though he didn't publish it widely. It shows the family cemetery on the Whitaker property. Small wooden markers, some of them rotted away to nothing. Dozens of graves, maybe more than 100, and most of them are small. Child-sized, infant-sized, some marked with names, many not marked at all. That cemetery tells the real story of the Whitaker legacy, not the ones who survived long enough to be filmed, but the ones who didn't, the ones who were born so damaged that they lived days, weeks, maybe months before their bodies gave out, the ones whose existence was so brief that they barely left a mark. But they were here, they were born, they suffered, and then they were buried in unmarked graves on land that had been in the family for generations, land that was supposed to be their inheritance but became their graveyard instead. And when the video went viral, when millions of people watched the Whitakers on their porch trying to communicate, trying to exist, something strange happened. The comment sections filled up with two reactions, horror and pity, but very little anger, very little rage at the system that allowed this to happen, at the social services that never intervened, at the communities that knew and said nothing, at the ideology that convinced generation after generation that this was acceptable. Instead, people focused on the Whitakers themselves, on how strange they looked, how unsettling they sounded, on whether it was ethical to film them, to profit from their tragedy. But those questions, while valid, miss the point entirely. The real question isn't whether we should look at the Whitakers. It's why we're only looking now. Why it took a viral video to notice what's been happening in plain sight for 200 years. And social services in West Virginia have known about families like the Whitakers for decades. Case files exist, reports were written. But intervention in cases of adult incest, in cases where the genetic damage is already done and the victims are now adults themselves, becomes legally and ethically complicated. You can't undo what's been done. You can't repair the genetic code, and the victims themselves often don't want intervention. They don't see themselves as victims. They see themselves as a family. They see outsiders as the threat, not the inbreeding. And so the system, such as it is, allows them to continue, provides minimal welfare support, looks the other way, because doing anything more would require acknowledging a truth that America doesn't want to face. That in our pursuit of individual freedom, of family autonomy, of privacy as a sacred right, we've allowed horrors to flourish in the spaces we don't look, and the poverty of the Whitakers is almost a distraction from the real tragedy. Yes, they live in structures that are barely habitable. Yes, they lack basic resources, but poverty can be addressed. Poverty can be fixed with money, with resources, with social programs. What's been done to their genes can't be fixed. Timmy will never speak. Lorene will never look like other people. The cognitive disabilities, the physical deformities, the shortened lifespans, these are permanent. These are carved into their DNA. And the cruelest part is that it didn't have to be this way. This wasn't a natural disaster. This wasn't random chance. This was a choice made by human beings who valued property and bloodline purity more than they valued the welfare of their own descendants. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you were born into a family where everyone you knew was a cousin? Where marriage outside the family was seen as betrayal? Where the only options were to continue the pattern or break it entirely and lose everything? Would you have had the courage to be the first one to say no? To walk away from land, from inheritance, from family identity itself? Or would you have done what generations of Whitakers did, what generations of isolated families across America did, and convinced yourself that it would be fine, that the risks were exaggerated, that your children would be the lucky ones? And because that's what each generation told themselves, they had to. The alternative was too painful. The alternative was admitting that they were hurting their own children, that they were gambling with human lives for the sake of tradition. So they rationalized. They pointed to the children who seemed normal, who functioned well enough, and said, see, it's fine. They ignored the ones who didn't survive, or who were so damaged they had to be hidden. They created a mythology around their family, a story of strength and independence and self-sufficiency, and they clung to that story even as the evidence mounted that they were destroying themselves from within. And Mark later returned to visit the Whitakers multiple times. He brought them supplies, paid for some repairs on their homes, and in doing so, he became part of their story. Some people praised him for it, called it compassionate. Others accused him of exploitation, of making money from their suffering. And maybe both things are true. Maybe you can't document tragedy without becoming entangled in it. But what strikes me most about his follow-up visits is how little had changed. The family was still there, still isolated, still living in conditions that most Americans would consider unlivable, still bearing the marks of generations of genetic damage. The viral video had changed their visibility, but it hadn't changed their reality. They were still trapped in a legacy they couldn't escape. And that's the thing about genetic damage. It doesn't heal. It doesn't fade with time. The Whitaker children who are alive today will carry those recessive genes for the rest of their lives. And if they have children, even with unrelated partners, those genes are still there, still waiting, still capable of expressing themselves if they meet another carrier. The damage is permanent. It's written into the family line now, and the only way to dilute it is through generations of outcrossing, of bringing in fresh genetics, of expanding the gene pool so dramatically that the harmful recessives become statistically unlikely to meet their match. But that requires something the Whitakers have never had: access education, the belief that the outside world is safe. And the legacy isn't just genetic, it's psychological. Generational trauma gets passed down just like genes do. The children who grew up watching their siblings suffer, who were taught that this was normal, that this was just how their family was, they carry that trauma. And even if they break the pattern, even if they marry outside the family, they carry the knowledge of what was done to them, what was done to their bloodline. And that knowledge doesn't go away. It becomes part of their identity, part of their story. The story they'll tell their children if they have the courage, or the story they'll bury if they don't. And there's a medical term that doctors use when they encounter certain genetic conditions: consanguinity. It's a clinical word, sterile and distant, that describes what happens when blood relatives reproduce. But that word carries with it an entire shadow history of human suffering. Every geneticist knows it. Every pediatrician who works in isolated communities has seen it. The distinct facial features, the developmental delays, the clustering of rare disorders that shouldn't appear with such frequency. And when they see it, they know. They know what's been happening in that family, what's been happening for generations. But knowing and being able to do something about it are two very different things. And the medical records for families like the Whitakers, when they exist at all, tell a story of systematic neglect. Children born at home, never registered, never seen by a doctor until something goes catastrophically wrong. Others who were seen by physicians but whose conditions were documented and then filed away with a note that the family declined further intervention. Declined further intervention. That phrase appears over and over in the scattered records that exist from Appalachian families practicing inbreeding. Because you can't force medical care on people who don't want it. You can't force genetic counseling on families who see their way of life as a choice, not a crisis. And so the medical establishment becomes a witness to horror it can't prevent. And the thing about genetic disorders caused by inbreeding is that they're not always immediately visible. Some children appear normal at birth. They hit early developmental milestones. They seem fine. And then, slowly, the damage reveals itself. Speech doesn't develop properly. Motor skills plateau. Seizures begin. The brain, built with too many copies of damaged genes, starts to fail in ways that become irreversible. And the parents, if they're capable of understanding what's happening, watch their child regress. Watch them lose abilities they once had. Watch them become trapped in a body that's betraying them because of decisions made generations ago. And in the Whitaker family, the generational pattern is written on their faces. You can trace it through Mark Lada's footage if you study it long enough. The way certain features repeat, the distinctive jaw structure, the wide, set eyes, the particular shape of the forehead. These aren't just family resemblances. These are genetic signatures, markers of consanguinity that any trained observer can identify. And they're markers that the family themselves probably can't see. Because when everyone looks like this, when these features are normal within your world, you don't recognize them as signs of damage. You just think this is what your family looks like. This is what you look like. And the outside world, with their different faces, their different structures, they're the ones who are strange. But the psychological damage runs even deeper than the physical. Imagine growing up knowing on some level that you're different, that people stare, that children run away, that adults speak to you in that slow, careful voice they use with people they think can't understand. Imagine navigating a world that's built for minds that work differently than yours, bodies that function differently than yours. And imagine knowing, somewhere deep down, that this wasn't random chance. This wasn't God's will. This was a choice your family made generation after generation that led to you being born the way you are. How do you process that? How do you live with that knowledge? And the Whitakers, insulated by their isolation, may never fully grasp the scope of what was done to them. They may never understand the science, the genetics, the statistical certainty that this would happen if you compress a gene pool to the size of a single family. And maybe that's a mercy. Maybe not knowing is easier than knowing. But the rest of us don't have that excuse. We know what causes this. We've known for over a century. We understand the mechanisms, the probabilities, the inevitable outcomes. And yet families across America, across the world, continue to practice inbreeding, sometimes for religious reasons, sometimes for cultural ones, sometimes simply because isolation and habit and fear of outsiders become more powerful than love for the children who will pay the price. And there's a documentary that never got made. In the 1990s, a filmmaker tried to chronicle multiple families across Appalachia who were living with the consequences of generational inbreeding. She interviewed social workers, doctors, geneticists. She identified at least 15 families in a single county in Kentucky who showed clear signs of consanguinity. She began filming, and then, quietly, the project was shut down. Funding disappeared. Access was denied. Families who had initially agreed to participate changed their minds. Because even now, even with all our scientific understanding, there's a shame attached to this that makes it almost impossible to discuss openly. The families don't want to be exposed. The communities don't want to be associated with it, and so it continues in darkness, hidden away, a secret that everyone knows but no one speaks. And the Whitakers became visible by accident. Mark Lada wasn't looking for them specifically. He was exploring rural America, documenting forgotten communities, and he stumbled upon them. And in that stumbling, he pulled back a curtain that reveals something most Americans would prefer to ignore. That in our country, in the 21st century, there are people living in conditions and with genetic damage that looks more like a medieval village than a modern nation. And the question that haunts me isn't just how did this happen? It's why are we letting it continue? Why do we watch these videos, feel brief horror or fascination, and then move on? Why isn't there outrage? Why isn't there intervention? Why do we accept that this is just the way some families are, as if genetic catastrophe is a lifestyle choice rather than a preventable tragedy? And the Whitaker family still lives in Odd, West Virginia. Right now, as you're watching this, they're there, in the same structures, on the same land, living the same isolated existence they've lived for generations. The viral video changed nothing fundamental about their reality. It brought attention. It brought some money through donations. It brought curiosity seekers and journalists and documentary filmmakers. But it didn't break the cycle, because the cycle isn't just about one family in one location. It's about an American mythology that values individual freedom and family autonomy above all else, even when that freedom becomes a prison and that autonomy becomes a death sentence written in genetic code. And there are children being born right now in isolated communities across this country who will carry the weight of their ancestors' choices in their DNA. Children who will struggle to speak, to walk, to think, because their parents were cousins or siblings or uncle and niece. Children who will never know what they could have been if their bloodline had been allowed to expand, to breathe, to mix with the genetic diversity that human bodies require to function properly. And we know this is happening. Social workers know, doctors know, geneticists know, but the machinery of intervention moves slowly, if it moves at all, because we've built a society that treats family privacy as sacred and genetic health as optional. And the Whitaker legacy is more than one family's tragedy. It's a mirror held up to American values and American failures. It asks us uncomfortable questions about what we're willing to tolerate in the name of freedom, about what happens when we decide that some lives matter less because they're hidden away in places we don't visit, in communities we don't understand, about whether we're capable of looking at human suffering and doing something more than watching, more than commenting, more than moving on to the next viral video. Because the Whitakers aren't a spectacle. They're evidence. Evidence of what happens when ideology, whether it's about blood purity or family loyalty or fear of outsiders, becomes more important than the welfare of human beings. And Mark Leita's most recent visit to the family was in 2023. He brought supplies again, filmed again, and the family was exactly as they've always been. Gentle, confused by the attention, trying their best to communicate with sounds and gestures in the limited language they have. And in that footage, there's a moment that I can't stop thinking about. Timmy, nonverbal Timmy, reaches out and touches Mark's camera. Just touches it, curious, wanting to understand this thing that keeps pointing at him, keeps recording him, keeps turning him into something for the outside world to consume. And in that gesture, there's something heartbreaking, because Timmy doesn't understand that he's become a symbol, that his face, his condition, his existence has been turned into a lesson about the dangers of inbreeding. He's just a person trying to make sense of strangers who keep showing up with cameras and questions. And the graves keep multiplying on the Whitaker property. New markers appear. Some of the family members filmed in earlier videos are gone now. The genetic burden they carried shortened their lives, as it was always going to. And the ones who remain are aging, their bodies breaking down faster than they should, because damaged genes don't just affect the brain and the face. They affect everything. The heart, the kidneys, the immune system. Every cell in their bodies carries the same compressed genetic code. The same accumulated mutations, the same evidence of a family that turned inward and stayed there for too long. But here's what we don't talk about enough. The Whitakers aren't the end of the line. There are younger members of the family, and unless someone intervenes, unless someone provides education and resources and real support, the pattern could continue. Another generation born into genetic catastrophe. Another set of children who pay for their ancestors' choices. And that's the real horror. Not what's already happened, but what might still happen. What will happen if we treat this as a curiosity rather than a crisis? If we watch the videos and shake our heads and feel grateful it's not us and then do absolutely nothing. And there's no clean ending to this story, no resolution, no moment where everything gets fixed and the family lives happily ever after. The damage is permanent. The genes don't repair themselves. The best case scenario is that the surviving Whitakers live out their lives with some measure of dignity and support, and that future generations break the pattern entirely, that they marry outside the family, that they expand the gene pool, that they choose differently than their ancestors did. But even that won't erase what's already been written into their DNA. It will only prevent it from getting worse. And the photograph I mentioned at the beginning, the one from the 1800s with the family on the porch, it's still in a box somewhere, still exists. And if you knew what to look for, you could see the damage even then. The features that repeat too precisely. The signs that this family had already been practicing inbreeding long before that photograph was taken. That image isn't the beginning of the story. It's evidence that the story was already well underway. And every photograph since then, including the ones Mark Leita took, are just chapters in an ongoing chronicle of what happens when human beings value the wrong things. When we choose isolation over integration. When we choose purity over health. When we choose tradition over the well-being of children who have no choice at all, and the Whitakers are still there, in odd West Virginia, living evidence of an American legacy that no one wants to claim but that belongs to all of us, because we built the society that allowed this to happen. We created the conditions where isolation could become genetic catastrophe. We decided that some families, in some places, could be left alone to make choices that would destroy themselves from within. And now we get to live with what that looks like. We get to see the faces of people whose bodies and minds are a record of our collective failure to care, to intervene, to value human life more than we value privacy and autonomy, and the mythology of the independent American family. And you've made it to the end. You've seen what most people turn away from. The question now is what you do with that knowledge. Whether you close this video and forget, or whether you remember. Whether you understand that the Whitakers aren't an anomaly, they're a consequence. And consequences don't end until we change the causes.